So we talked about mitigation. Now, the other climate change action that's often talked about is adaptation. So we have to talk about adaptation because the effects of climate change are unavoidable in some regions. So these risks from climate change range from reductions in rainfall to increase in temperature to more severe droughts, more extreme weather. And we need to adapt to these sort of impacts, which are already happening. So adaptation are coping strategies or actions to protect ourselves from negative impacts of climate change. Now, in the case of adaptation, what the best response would be depends very much on the local circumstances. It will vary with households, different types of businesses, different regions, different countries, depending on where they are, how much impact they're experiencing, what their ability to adapt. We'll all have a different response, which means that adaptation is not a top-down international coordinated response, but consists largely of very local bottom-up actions. And I'll show you a bunch of examples. So the sort of actions we're talking about for adaptation in Australia, for example, is protecting our coasts from more extreme storms and from higher seas. This is one of the main priorities for adaptation in Australia. We can do this by building storm breaks in the ocean, dumping sand on the beach, or increasing and vegetating dunes. Water security and ensuring that we have enough drinking water in the face of less rainfall is another important focus. So this is a photo of Perth's desalination plant, which is an example of adaptation to having less drinking water available. Protecting ecosystems from climate change is also very important. This is a photo of coral bleaching, which occurs when the ocean temperatures are increase. And the Australian government is aiming to reduce the stresses on climate change that are, The Australian government is aiming to reduce the stress on ecosystems that are not related to climate change. So in the case of the Great Barrier Reef, for example, they may work very hard to reduce pollution that runs off from the land so that the ecosystem is less stressed and therefore may be better able to withstand negative impacts of climate change. Another adaptation measure around national ecosystems is to increase the area of national parks to encourage species migration and conservation. So if they have more habitat available, they'll be more resilient to the effects of climate change. With the increased frequency of extreme weather, there's also a need to look at emergency management. So the risk of natural disasters like flood and bushfires is increasing, and we need to be prepared. And adaptation is preparing for those natural disasters as well. And finally, agriculture is probably the one sector in our economy that is most vulnerable to effects of climate change. So there's a lot of research going into helping farmers to adapt to climate change by producing new crop varieties that are more resistant to drought, developing more efficient water use and irrigation technologies. Even insurance exists now for climate change impacts. So let me give you a couple of examples of climate adaptation responses here in Australia. I've tried to source them very locally. So let's look at Mandurah, for example, which is experiencing climate change impacts. The increasing levels of the sea are affecting erosion rates. So they are finding that beaches are washed away more and more. And you can see in this photo that with increased erosion or increased sea levels, these houses may become at risk as well. Then with changes in rainfall and runoff, they are experiencing increased stress on canals and river walls, which you may also have seen if you walk along the Swan River. Sometimes these river walls break down because of the increased stress and the changes in river water levels. Then there's also, because of temperature changes in the ocean currents change slightly, which changes the movement of the sand, which changes sand deposition on the beach. All these things need to be taken into account. There's various impacts on existing and future coastal infrastructure. So what the Mandurah Council has done is they've actually taken these potential impacts and incorporated them in their local government planning. So currently, if you want to develop a business, for example, along the coast, you have to include a risk assessment into your planning approval. So this might not sound that much, but just incorporating this potential climate change effect into local government plans is a huge step forward to recognizing that climate change may have an impact. So Mandurah is actually recognized as one of the most adaptive local governments in Australia, which is why I chose it as an example. Let's go to another example with in agriculture, which is a vulnerable sector. So in our wheat belt, there's lots in production of sheep and wheat. And with an increase in temperature, they're experiencing heat stress on crops and sheep. Less rainfall means that soils are drying out and the yields may reduce. And therefore, there will be impacts on the profit for farmers in the wheat belt. So what are they doing? I included a little picture to show you where the wheat belt is. There's different adaptation strategies, for example, no tillage, to reduce the loss of soil moisture. Extending fallows to capture soil moisture. But also building improved management decision support systems and using GIS technology. So using GIS, for example, they can be much more accurate in applying fertilizer, in applying irrigation, which saves water, which saves fertilizer. Because if you over-apply fertilizer, you also emit more greenhouse gases. So more precise means you waste less resources, which means you probably increase your profit. Planting later in the season is an adaptation strategy because then there might be more water, but also developing and breeding new crops, varieties that are better suited to either more drought or just extreme weather variation. The final example that I want to show you is again in a different sector, and this time the mining industry. Such a big industry in WA. And I found this example by Fortescue Metals, which is planning to expand its Pilbara operations. And they recognized that the design of future infrastructure needs to account for the risks of future climate change impact. So this is a bit like the local council example, where they accounted for the risk of climate change in their planning documents. So what Fortescue did is they did a risk assessment on, well, what type of weather could we expect? What are the climate change impacts that could occur in the Pilbara? And what would be the impact on our business? What can we do? So they collected lots of information on climate change projections, the predicted weather, and then adapted their engineering design to suit those risks. That also raised internal company awareness. So that sort of adapted planning is an example of adaptation as well. So after talk about adaptation, let's have another short break, and then I'll talk about Australia's emissions and policies.